Welcome to WOLA. I'm Adam Isaacson. I work on defense and security here at WOLA, and it's just great to have you here. It's great to have you here who are online. Housekeeping, if you do need a translation, the remarks will be in English. If you prefer Spanish, you should have signed up via Zoom. That's if you're here. If you're watching, you already signed up via Zoom. And you can use the Zoom feed with your telephone earbuds to listen to the Spanish feed. But I don't see any takers, so that's good. Okay. So again, thanks for coming. This is an urgent issue we're talking about. As of yesterday, 16 attacks, 67 people killed so far on this, on multiple boat strikes in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. During the first month of strikes, 3 attacks, 17 dead. During the second month, 12 attacks, 48 killed. 2 more yesterday, which was the first strike that happened after the 60-day window began. Here at WOLA, we have done a lot of work since the 1970s on U.S. support, trying to halt or condition U.S. support for military security forces in Latin America that were killing civilians. Unity. Now we've cut out the middleman. This is new territory for us also. U.S. forces are doing the killing themselves. But understanding what's happening now does require some different specializations of knowledge. You need drug policy expertise, international law expertise, war powers, U.S. war powers, and military human rights law here in the United States. The whole question of terrorism and narco-terrorism, what those labels mean, if anything, what this all means for U.S. democracy, what it means for U.S. relations with Latin America, with Venezuela, obviously, security, politics, geopolitics. Nobody's expert at all of these, which is why it's great to have a diverse panel here today drawing on many of these areas. I'm going to turn it over to your moderator, Amanda Klasing of Amnesty International. Thank you for coming again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I'm really grateful for WOLA hosting us in this space, and I'm grateful that we're also able to have this conversation with both simultaneous translation, so both in English and Spanish. It's an important conversation that's been happening for the last 2 months, and it's great to be able to share it more in a public setting and space. I want, before we get started, to really center both the many victims and survivors of the fentanyl crisis in the United States, and the more than, or at least 66 or 67 people who have been killed outside the color of law. There are people behind the conversations that we're having. There are families that don't know where their loved one is and what happened to them. Whatever the allegations or the reasons for these killings, people have an inherent human right to due process and an inherent human right to expect more from the United States government. And so I want us to just remember that we will get into the specifics, but to not forget, it's easy to get sensitized at this point in time, as every week we're seeing that number go up. What we're not seeing is that there are families behind those numbers. And in the United States, there are families that are hurting and being cut off from the types of assistance that has given some hope to addressing the drug crisis in the United States. And so just to make sure that we keep that at the heart of the conversation. I'm so grateful to be sharing space today with these exceptional speakers. I want to just flag how we will kind of proceed with the conversation. This is not just going to be a panel of, speaking at you. Really, we want to get into the dialogues that we've been having together in different civil society spaces, so that you can understand and see the exchange that is needed between different advocacy and policy communities. Different levels of expertise is required to understand, unpack what's happening, so that we can work forward to making sure that it stops. And so we'll start with some questions. We will have a conversation, and then we want you to be able to join in the conversation. So we will have a question and answer period in the presentation. I will rudely be on my phone to see what those questions are from our virtual participants. So at that point in time, I will also be able to hear from you all. And we have a lovely assistant that will be providing the interlocutor role between what's happening virtually and what's happening up here. I also want to acknowledge that we have a translator providing simultaneous translation. I promised myself I would let the panelists know we need to speak slowly, and I'm already finding myself not doing so. So at different periods of time, I may just interrupt to slow us down and to speak a little bit more clearly so that our colleague on the line can catch up, those of you that are taking advantage of the Spanish translation. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. I'm so grateful to be sharing space with Brian Finucane from Crisis Group. We've been on many calls together over the last 2 years and never sitting in close proximity. So this is a real pleasure. Brian is the senior advisor with the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group. At Crisis Group, he focuses on developing policies and institutional checks to decrease U.S. reliance on military tools and foreign affairs, including through legislative reforms of war powers. He's got an exemplary CV, but I will just flag that prior to joining Crisis Group, Finucane worked for a decade in the office of the legal advisor at the State Department, and so has the perspective both inside and outside of the U.S. government. I'm also grateful to be here with Katherine Yon Ebright from the Brennan Center for Justice. Katherine is a counsel of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, where she focuses on war powers and the constitutional separation of powers. Her work has been published in outlets including all over, Just Security, Chicago Tribune, The Hill, and others. And her commentary has also been featured in everywhere from the New York Times to Vox. We also have with us Lara Deeb from WOLA, from Washington office on Latin America. Lara is the Venezuela program director at WOLA, where she works with partners in Venezuela and in the region to advocate for democracy and respect for human rights. She's a lawyer and studied in Venezuela and also here in the United States. And finally, but not last but not least, I suppose, not least at all, is Sanho Tree from the Institute for Policy Studies. I have only recently been sharing space with Sanho and have so appreciated his insights and the historical context that he'll share with you all today, under which we should understand these policies. He is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he's directed its drug policy project since 1998. That project works to end the domestic and international war on drugs and replace it with policies that promote public health and safety in countries such as the Philippines, Colombia, Bolivia, Mexico, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and the US. He's also a former military and diplomatic historian and has done extensive work across a variety of issues, including working at the International Human Rights Law Group in the late 1980s. And if you all remember the important work that institution did in seeking accountability, it's a pleasure to have that perspective here with us today. And with that, when I stopped and paused to identify who we should put at the center of this conversation, I failed to also mention that there are people in Venezuela that have been working hard and advocating for their democracy and for their lives, that are very much so afraid of what this conversation is, what's happening in the United States, and how out of control they are of what comes next. And so there's a level of anxiety that runs across borders. So with that, I would like to open up to each of our panelists to help us understand the context. Where are we at? How did we get here? And Brian, I'll start with you thinking from an international law perspective.
Well, in terms of what we're seeing from the vantage point of international law, these lethal strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific have been characterized by a range of international law experts as a violation of the right to life under international human rights law and extrajudicial killings. Okay. Now, the U.S. government has, in a piecemeal fashion and without much in the way of explanation, sought to justify these strikes on the basis that the U.S. is supposedly involved in a non-international armed conflict with unspecified designated terrorist organizations, and that the United States has suffered an armed attack in some fashion. Now, those are terms of art in international law, but it's very notable that the U.S. government, when it made these assertions, did so solely on the basis of presidential determination, presidential fiat. There was no detailed factual explanation as to how the United States is actually in a non-international armed conflict to which the law of war would apply and could potentially serve as a justification for these premeditated killings. Nor was there any sort of detailed explanation as to how the United States suffered an armed attack for purposes of international law, which might provide a basis for using force. So what we're left with are premeditated killing outside of armed conflict. For international law purposes, it's been characterized as extrajudicial killings. For U.S. domestic law purposes, we call that murder.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian, for setting the legal scene for us. Katherine, can you help us understand, people that may not really think about and engage in foreign policy as much, what's the domestic context that we need to understand these attacks?
Yeah, thank you. I think Brian may, at a later point in this conversation, get into some of the war powers questions about the separation of war powers between the Congress and the presidency. But I want to actually take us to first the 1990s, when Congress, for the first time, enacts a law into the Immigration and Nationality Act that creates the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, or FTO designation. This is a time period when lawmakers, politicians, the public thinks about terrorism as a criminal law matter, as an immigration law matter. And so this Foreign Terrorist Organization, or FTO designation, is actually only about unlocking deportation and admissions consequences, potential prosecution if you provide material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, and some economic sanctions or blocking of transactions through financial institutions. That's the sum total of what Congress did in the 1990s, because again, this was just a totally different framework for thinking about terrorism. You move then to, of course, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and that is the first time that we start talking about terrorism as really this war context, and the Bush administration chooses the war-based approach for countering Al-Qaeda, and we're now in this conflict with a non-state actor. That's after the attacks on September 11, and Al-Qaeda had, prior to that, attacked U.S. embassies abroad, attacked U.S. Bases and service members abroad, and this was an attack on the homeland that killed thousands of people, and also they attacked the Pentagon. And so, it's very different from, someone doing narcotics trafficking or everyday criminal activity that was previously the framework for foreign terrorist organizations. They're also emerging from the 9/11 attacks was a decision by President Bush to use a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to create something called the Specially Designated Global Terrorist Status. And IEPA is only for economic sanctions, for freezing assets. But the sort of paradigm, the political paradigm shift, was to thinking about terrorism as something that we deal with using war, even though the tools for the FTO designation, the SDGT designation, are actually entirely immigration, criminal, and economic sanctions tools. Congress separately then enacted a war authority to go after Al-Qaeda. That authority obviously has no relevance to gangs or cartels that operate in Latin America. But we are in that sort of political framework, and so we've seen the administration use that language, use an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization designation, to sort of smooth the path politically, or an SDGT designation to smooth the path politically for putting us into, or messaging to the public, that we should be in this war frame. And that's incredibly dangerous. And I think the narrative has gotten very far away from what Congress ever intended and from what the law actually does. And so that's, I think, a huge part of how we got here. Just the mismatch between the understanding of terrorism in law and the understanding of terrorism and politics and some of this conflation with Al-Qaeda and that specific authority for pursuing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm going to just pause for a second because, Jose, I know that that is a lot of legal terminology to be translating for folks. And AIPA, I'm sure, is a word we're all learning today because of Supreme Court. We'll come back to that. Laura, can you help us understand the regional context? What this is all happening with what context in Venezuela and the broader region?
Yes, I think it's very important to condemn and denounce this extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean, understanding the domestic implications and broader implications of these actions, while at the same time seeing what is happening inside Venezuela. Yes. Okay. Well, at the same time, understanding the context in Venezuela, I have seen how things in Washington are seen under a different light than inside Venezuela. Venezuelans have fought for democracy and the protection of human rights for years. They have committed to many rounds of negotiation, participation in elections under unfair and unfree conditions. After the July 28 elections, over 2,000 people were detained. There were 25 unlawful killings also inside Venezuela. And as of today, there's this context of repression that Venezuelans want a change. If you saw over the weekend, the polling by Bloomberg, over 74 people of the persons that were polled said, Venezuela would be better off without Nicolás Maduro in power. And there's no evidence that he won the July 28 election. In fact, there's all the evidence to prove that he didn't win the elections. Now, does that justify the violation of international law? No, it doesn't. It doesn't justify the use of force in the Caribbean and the killing of 67 people. So I think it's important for the US administration to have a foreign policy that is robust and that stands with Venezuelans in their fight for democracy, but it's also aligned with international law and that is respectful and that doesn't create more very dangerous precedents for the region and for the world.
Thank you so much, Lara. Sanho, we've heard a little bit about the legal, the domestic, and the regional context. Do you have both the historical and the drug policy context? Can you help us understand where are we at right now and how we got here?
Yeah, okay. I was in first grade when Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs. So for the past half century or more, we've been living through this experiment. And that's how we should view it, as an experiment in prohibition rather than a norm. It wasn't the natural state of things. So we're now talking about one drug in particular, cocaine in this case. We can talk about fentanyl later, but cocaine in terms of South America. Our politicians have lost sight of the fact of why people use drugs and why people produce drugs. And a lot of those root causes are buried in issues of poverty, despair, and alienation, both on the consumption side and production side. Instead of acknowledging or addressing those, the politicians say, this is illegal, we're going to make you stop. And so the way they try to do that is through law enforcement eradication. Keep in mind that Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia are the three major cocaine producers, coca growers. Colombia is bigger than Texas and California combined. So is Peru, so is Bolivia. These are very large land masses. And if you look at the latest statistics on how much coca was produced, it's about 253,000 hectares, according to the UN, throughout this region. Put that in terms for the US audience, it's about 977 square miles. Meaning that if you took the square root of that, all of the coca necessary for the world can be grown on a square piece of land, 31 miles by 31 miles, right? Now imagine trying to eradicate that buried in this huge landmass of South America. That's the fantasy we're engaged in. What that has done is caused a lot of upheaval and suffering. It's fueled revolutions, it's fueled grievances, and it's also caused this drug economy to evolve at a lightning pace. Because one of the things we've done is put out a price support, basically, for drug traffickers. We're talking about, when we talk about cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, marijuana, these are minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to manufacture. There's nothing exotic about these plants, right? They're cheap. But what we've done is increase the risk premium for the traffickers, so much so that they can charge more for the next person down the smuggling chain. So we provide a price support, if you will, a crop subsidy sort of for the drug war. And we will never make these substances disappear by making them astronomically more valuable, which is what our policies do. That's one of the reasons this hasn't been working.
Okay, so I am going to turn back to you because I want you to also help us when we get into the deeper conversation. Level set about the allegations that this is about, these attacks are about fentanyl. So help us understand why there are questions related to that, why we should be questioning the rhetoric that is driving this, and what the implications of that are, and what we know of past mistakes that have been made by U.S. Authorities when it comes to targeting traffickers.
Yeah, so fentanyl is not part of the equation in this case. In South America, neither Venezuela nor Colombia are engaged in fentanyl to any meaningful degree. It's all added in Mexico using chemicals, precursors from China and other countries. That's where it gets added. So there's just to say it up front, there is no fentanyl involved in these attacks right now, although that's what Trump keeps saying. We have to understand why we got into this fentanyl disaster to begin with. And Bill Clinton used to say, if you see a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by itself, right? The market didn't decide one day, I would really like fentanyl. That's much more fun than heroin. It's not, right? People prefer heroin, but you can't find it. It's harder to find. And that's because we created the market incentives for fentanyl. There's something called the iron law of prohibition. People in the home audience should Google that. But basically what it means is that as long as you have high demand under prohibition, you end up with products that are of higher potency, that are easier to produce, more difficult to stop, more problematic in every way. Much in the same way that alcohol prohibition turned a nation of beer drinkers and wine drinkers into a nation of hard liquor consumers. If you were a bootlegger, a smuggler during alcohol prohibition a century ago, the last thing you wanted to smuggle was beer. All the market incentives were to smuggle hard liquor or grain alcohol. The more purity, the better. And so that's why we keep coming up with these more dangerous, problematic drugs. Our war on opium helped, in some ways popularize morphine. Clamping down on that helped popularize heroin, and then substitute heroin, fentanyl. There are many analogs of fentanyl, some of which are much more potent than the stuff we see in the streets. And it hasn't taken over the market yet, and I hope it really doesn't. But we have to stop creating the incentives to push traffickers to smuggle more compact, easier to produce, more potent drugs. And that's what we've been doing for decades now. And so we've not only lost the war on drugs miserably, but we are creating, through our policies, a much more dangerous environment. And that unfortunately fits with a lot of the Republican talking points these days, that instead of talking about harm reduction, that every life has value and that we want people to live so that they might be able to recover. You can't recover once you've overdosed, right? So if you believe all lives are valuable, then you support harm reduction and keeping people alive until they're able to recover. And instead, their philosophy these days seems to be the wages of sin ought to be death, that these people need to die to set an example, teach other people not to do these things. And it's never worked.
And understanding that kind of policy analysis in the context of these strikes, first of all, these are not about fentanyl, but that message isn't getting out. But also, are these effective drug policies?
No, and neither are they about terrorism. Well, let's just put that out first.
I have that next.
Almost in all cases, fishermen, because it makes no sense to hire terrorists to smuggle your drugs. You're going to want to hire people who know the sea, who spent their lives on the sea, who know how to evade law enforcement, who know how to look normal on the open ocean, who know how to survive storms and things. You're not going to hire a cartel gunman, a sicario, to put in a little boat in the middle of the ocean. What good does that do you? They're going to shoot fish. And the moment you run into a government vessel, you're outgunned. So it makes no sense to hire a gunman on these boats. And the first boat they struck, 11 people were on board. How many drug smugglers want to split their proceeds 11 ways? That makes no sense. Trinidad is less than 10 miles from the coast of Venezuela. There's lots of commerce. There's lots of, water taxis. There's all kinds of things going on in between. And they made no effort to discern. They just blew up this boat without presenting any evidence. These things don't add up.
And I'm going to go to you, Brian. What does it mean if a government is using its military to blow up vessels with 11 people with no evidence, no additional information? We don't know more. Can you help us understand what is the legal context? What are the implications? And, really, what authorities is the president operating under? And if he's not, what are the implications with Congress?
So the bottom line up front is that these strikes are lawless. Okay. The president has invoked the supposed authority under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution as commander in chief and chief executive. There is no congressional authorization for these strikes. And we've seen Congress push back against them. There was a vote in October on a resolution brought forward by Senators Schiff, Kane, that in the Senate did not get majority support, but got a fair number of votes, including from 2 by Republicans, that was sought to block additional strikes at sea. And we have, of course, a ticking clock, a clock that reached 60 days under the War Powers Resolution of 1973 that establishes both reporting requirements and time limits when the president is using military force without prior congressional authorization. And the administration has blown past that 60-day time limit, blew past it on Monday. And so this most recent strike announced yesterday was a further violation of U.S. law, in addition to getting criminal statutes. And so we have a mounting illegality here in terms of the strikes, even solely from the vantage point of U.S. law.
I also want, because I feel like I've had this conversation. We have activists in our Amnesty network that are trying to understand why we don't say civilians. What's the difference between humanitarian law and human rights law? Can you just help folks understand what is the operating law to really think about what is happening? What are the international legal obligations that the administration has?
So the administration has asserted that the United States is in a non-international armed conflict. That's a term of legal art, a non-international armed conflict with unspecified supposed designated terrorist organizations. Again, that term DTO is something the U.S. government has been using repeatedly. It may have some internal significance for the U.S. government. It's not a legal term of art. Okay, so the U.S. is supposedly in an armed conflict with these unspecified groups, in the same way that it was in an armed conflict with Al Qaeda or ISIS in the actual war on terror. But that's bogus. Okay, there is no armed conflict. Many of these entities that the U.S. seems to be using force against or claims to be using force against may not even have the characteristics that they could be in an armed conflict with the United States. Things like groups like Tren de Aragua seem to lack the internal organization, military type hierarchy capabilities, which would enable them to be in an armed conflict with the United States. And so the reason the U.S. government is claiming that it's in an armed conflict with these unspecified groups is that it could potentially excuse what would otherwise be patently unlawful, that is a premeditated killing. Under the law of armed conflict, in the context of armed conflict, the use of lethal force against combatants or those directly participating in hostilities is lawful. Okay. And so the administration has tried to paint the people aboard some of these vessels, the people it's referring to as narco-terrorists, and sometimes refers to them as unlawful combatants. Okay, and again, this is an attempt to repurpose the framing from the war on terror and apply that to these lethal strikes and alleged drug traffickers. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work because there's no armed conflict. There's no showing that these people are belong to any organized armed group. No showing that even if there is an armed conflict, these people would be lawful targets. And so we're left with unjustified premeditated killing. The notion that this is somehow analogous to the war on terror is completely bogus. There's been no prior attack in the United States akin to what the United States suffered on 9/11. Congress has not enacted a war authorization as it did after 9/11. And of course, again, the United States is not engaged in armed conflict in the way that it was with Al Qaeda, ISIS, or their various affiliates over the past 20 years. But again, the administration is very cynically trying to use that framing because people, frankly, many Americans have been habituated and inured to the regular use of lethal force against supposed terrorists over the past 2 decades. And the administration is trying to rely on that to engage this unlawful killing at sea.
Thanks so much, Brian. I'll wait for a moment for catching up, and then I'm going to go to Katherine. So Katherine, you helped us understand that in the 90s, the legal framework that was built out under IEPA and others was from a law enforcement frame and economic sanctions. What is the value for this administration to use a narco-terrorism frame? Why are they trying to do that? And where does this fit into the Alien Enemies Act assertions by this administration? Can you help us understand the rhetorical value of this?
Yeah, so I think Brian summed it up very well just now, and I spoke about it earlier, where we have seen since 9/11 a war frame, a global war on terror frame, be applied to groups, certain groups that have been, identified as terrorist organizations, specifically Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates, including the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and some of its affiliates. And so we've seen the war on terror stretch pretty broadly across countries, and it gave the administration the idea or the confidence to say, well, what if any organization that I refer to as a terrorist organization, I can bring within that same framework, at least as a matter of politics, and then by fudging the law. Because as we've discussed, the terrorist designations that do exist in law are not about war. They're about those criminal, immigration, and economic sanctions consequences. And so at the very start of this administration, Trump designated for the first time a series of gangs and cartels from across Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations. And that's when really all of this mischief began. And we started to see that conflation of crime and war. And to very, very quickly pop back into the 1990s, if you look at the congressional debates, if you look at what government officials were saying, Clinton administration officials were saying about this new foreign terrorist organization designation that they were enacting, they talk about how this is not for gangs or cartels. It's not about Latin America and drug smuggling. It's about ideological or political organizations that are, waging challenges to the security of the state. And so when the Trump administration does these novel designations of gangs and cartels, it's novel. And then it's to weaponize some of these war authorities. And the first place where we saw that happening was with the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. And so that is a US law that dates very close to the founding of the country, back when the country had basically no national security law, didn't have a standing navy. It had very, very few national security tools, and yet the United States in the 1700s, sorry to drag you all back into history, was waging its first war with a foreign power, France. And so the Congress, having these basically no tools for President Adams to wage this war, gave Adams this exceptional power, if that war escalated into a major conflict, to intern people from France and to expel people from France who happened to be in the United States. What Trump did in March, bouncing off of that earlier FTO designation of Tren de Aragua from Venezuela, was say, well, maybe we are in a major war with Tren de Aragua. And maybe there are connections between this Venezuelan gang and the Maduro regime. And so he issued this proclamation saying we're in an irregular war or engaged in irregular warfare with this gang that's being operated by the quote unquote hybrid criminal state led by Maduro. And then in invoking that law, he used it to round up several hundred Venezuelan immigrants and deport them without due process by simply saying they're gang members. And no court can review this. Those individuals were deported to El Salvador, the notorious Secot prison, because the administration viewed this law as also a way to bypass the prohibition on sending someone to a place where they might fear or face torture or persecution based on, their identity or beliefs. And so this exceptional authority was this first step into we're going to use war powers to try to address immigration. We're going to use war powers to say we're addressing crime, not that there's any evidence that the people that they targeted actually were criminals. They just happened to be from Venezuela. That policy, the Alien Enemies Act policy, has been held up in the courts since March. And the courts have said almost uniformly that the administration can't continue doing these summary deportations because that's a wartime law. And there's no indicia that we're actually suffering an armed attack. There's no indicia that we're suffering an invasion by Venezuela. And so a conservative appellate court handed down this kind of ruling at the start of September. At the start of September, we also saw the start of this policy. And so, it's just another escalation toward the conflation of crime and war. And perhaps for some in the administration, an effort to bolster the credibility of that conflation and try to get the courts to stay away or defer to the administration's attempt to blend when war authorities or war powers are appropriate and can be used against everyday people who they don't even necessarily figure out who they are. And so that's part of this narrative.
It's really helpful, and I will pause for a moment. And then I'll move to Laura. Can you help us understand this conflation between cartels and the Venezuelan government? Can you help us understand in the region there is a problem with gangs and cartels, and yet can you help us understand the Venezuelan and regional context, both of these gangs and cartels, and how the region is responding to the allegations of there being a relationship between the government, in particular in Venezuela, and these cartels?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think that during this panel, during this conversation, we have talked about the lack of evidence of some of the claims that are being done by the Trump administration, like the fact that Venezuela produces fentanyl, which there isn't. But I do want to make this conversation more complex and understand that there are, in this very broad context of misinformation, there are a lot of things that are partly true or for the most part true as well. So on the first hand, it is important to understand that in Venezuela, all democratic institutions have been dismantled. Venezuela occupies the position 178 out of 180 countries in the Index of Perception of Corruption by Transparency International. That corruption has facilitated the flourishing of illicit economies with the participation, to some extent, of the Venezuelan government. Again, it is not true that Venezuela is the main source of fentanyl or even of cocaine, but it is true that there's a system in which corruption and illicit economies are embedded in the Maduro government. So one thing that strikes me of how things are unfolding right now is that U.S. actions are making Maduro portray himself as a victim here. When the Maduro government is not a normal government, it wasn't elected democratically, and this connection between the military and illicit economies goes way back, even before Chavez was in power. The term of cartel de los soles was coined in 1993 or around that time, and it was used to explain the connection between the military and the illicit economies, and in particular, drug trafficking. It is true that it doesn't have the same structure or hierarchical form of other cartels in the region, but the term is used, and Inside Crime has very technically put this as a term that allows to understand a system in which the military is involved in these illicit economies. It's not just drug trafficking, it's also illegal mining that is destroying the environment in Amazonas. There is also the smuggling of Venezuelan migrants that, of course, not because the government does it, but because there's this context of impunity that allows for these groups to operate. And that also spills over into the region. For example, for Colombia, and even the DEA has been saying this since 2005, Venezuela stopped collaborating with US authorities in trying to undermine drug trafficking, and the lack of cooperation with the US and the lack of investigation of this illicit economies in Venezuela makes it really difficult to combat drug trafficking in Colombia. And the ELN, for example, has now permeated into Venezuela. So what I want to say with all of this is, yes, the US government is saying some claims that lack evidence, but at the same time, Venezuela is under an authoritarian government that does have deep links with illicit economies, and Venezuelans also deserve a right to democracy and the protection of their human rights. Now, how should that be done? While supporting Venezuelans in their fight for democracy. Last year, the US used to invest $37 million in democracy and human rights program. This year, there's zero money going into those programs. And there has been this contradiction that we've seen since January on their policy towards Venezuela. We saw the Rick Grinnell approach and then the Rubio approach. The return of the 252 people that were returned to from El Salvador, to Venezuela, those negotiations didn't lead to democratic openings either. So I think that we need to make this conversation more complex and understand the nuances and the deep complexities of the Venezuelan current context.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Pause for a moment. And then I'll move to you, Sanho, because Laura raised some issues related to kind of how illicit economies have worked in the region in the past and currently. And I've heard you speak before about the difference between a cartel and an illicit economy or a criminal network and, say, a terrorist network. So why is there a difference? And why is targeting and killing members of what the administration is calling a narco-terrorist organization not a law enforcement activity, or we'll get to the law enforcement and military, but is not a productive activity to even meet the objectives that they may be saying they're trying to meet?
First of all, I think it's important to point out that narco-terrorism really isn't a thing. These are narcotics traffickers. Sometimes they inflict terror on people. They certainly scare people, but they're not terrorists. So the term narco-terrorism first started being used in the 90s, I think around Peru and the insurgency there, but it never took off. After 9/11, the Bush-Cheney administration tried to hitch an increasingly unpopular war on drugs to a more popular war on terror. You may recall, those of you old enough, TV ads warning children, kids, if you smoke a joint, you're helping bin Laden. Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with marijuana. They're completely not related. And that was kind of a pathetic, lame campaign they tried to launch. It didn't really go very far. But now you're hearing it again, narco-terror, narco-terror, narco-terror. And it's important to call out the nonsense of this. It's a complex phenomenon. Terrorism and drug trafficking, two different phenomenon, very complex roots. What they're trying to do is fuse the two together to produce a one-size-fits-all solution, namely one that requires aircraft carriers and B-1 bombers to solve. Now, if you understand what motivates terrorists, it's basically ideology, grievance, political agendas, and if you look at what motivates narco traffickers, it's money. They don't care what your ideology or your religion is. And so it doesn't help us understand the phenomenon. Al Capone, we don't call him an alco terrorist. He was a bootlegger. He was a gangster. Jeffrey Epstein is not a terror pedo. He's a pedophile, even though he terrorized many of the children he trafficked. So we need to understand the different roots of these problems and the dangers of a one-size-fits-all solution. So what happens if you drop bombs on terrorists instead of using more precise police work? You end up creating a big footprint and a lot of collateral damage that very often, we blew up a lot of wedding parties in Afghanistan. We made lots of mistakes in the drug war as well, killing lots of innocent civilians. And it tends to, help create sympathy almost for some of these people. And it magnifies the problem. It creates more outrage. So you don't want to amplify the motivational feedback loop of the people you're trying to stop. What happens if you drop those same bombs on drug traffickers? Well, if you're the one in the boat, it's bad luck for you. You're having a very bad day. But everyone else in your organization or rival organizations, they got lucky because now everyone beneath you gets to move up a notch. You know, they get promoted, they get more money. Or rival cartels say, they've destroyed this route, they've been weakened here, we can take over their turf now. You create a job opportunity. Again, you don't want to create, you don't want to amplify the motivational feedback loops of the people you're trying to stop. That's the danger of using this very kinetic, macho, militarized solution to tackle a very complex problem.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was actually going to go to both of you, so I'll go ahead and go to you. Can you answer that question, but also the question, what's the legal problem of using military and law enforcement purposes?
I will actually address two things from Lara and Sanho, and maybe Brian, if I'm dragging on for a while, can address the sort of legal significance of using military force abroad to address narcotics trafficking. But the first thing that I wanted to say is, Lara, you talked about the Venezuelan government and its connection to Cartel de los Soles, right? And our viewers may have noticed that when Brian and I were talking about what the administration has done, a lot of the administration messaging, its Alien Enemies Act invocation, this whole time has been about Tren de Aragua, a different group. And so I think it really goes to the shifting narratives, the incoherency, when this administration says that these gangs are perpetrating an armed attack against the United States, and then they can't even figure out which group they think is the one who's doing the attack. Where if we go into Venezuelan territory, it's because we're at war with Cartel de los Soles and Maduro is the head of Cartel de los Soles. But also that's a different thing from what the administration is telling the courts in its litigation over the Alien Enemies Act. And so I think that really that inconsistency at the ground level on the facts should really call into question what this policy is domestically and abroad. And then Sanho, in terms of the danger of just slapping this terrorism or narco-terrorist label on gangs and cartels and then using kinetic force, two of the organizations that this administration has designated as foreign terrorist organizations were founded in the United States, in California. And so MS-13 was founded in the United States, Barrio 18 was founded in the United States. And if we're going to say that the approach to these organizations needs to be the same approach that we took on the global war on terror, just as a matter of policy, setting aside all of the illegality, the lack of authorization, are we talking about targeting narcotics trafficking that is happening domestically by people who were born and raised in the United States, who maybe have foreign connections, but, are really of and from here? And so I think we may get into that question a little bit more, but just the absurdity of taking that language and applying it as broadly as they have, I think it's really underscored.
If I could say a few words on the law enforcement paradigm versus the armed conflict paradigm as applied to, counter narcotics. As Sanho's laid out, even if you take the perspective that, we need to approach the scourge of drugs from the supply side, but we have a well-established playbook for doing that. Mark Nevitt wrote a great piece for Just Security describing the decades-long cooperation between the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard for identifying, stopping, interdicting, boarding, searching vessels suspected of carrying narcotics in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Okay, and when there's probable cause, taking people into custody and then prosecuting them through the U.S. criminal justice system. We have this well-established playbook for doing this, and so the administration really has not established why it's using lethal force in the first instance, why it is applying as it would be an armed conflict paradigm, a counterterrorism paradigm, to these vessels. It doesn't make sense if from a counter-drugs perspective. So why are they doing it? I think it's useful to take a step back and to put this in a broader context. A few things are going on here. From his first administration onwards, the president has mulled the possibility of doing missile strikes on narcos. Originally, he was thinking about doing that in Mexico. Cooler heads in administration seem to have steered away from doing drone strikes in Mexico. The president also has long had an affection for dramatic performative military action, particularly airstrikes on supposed terrorists. And so one of the functions that these strikes in the Caribbean fulfill is perform military action basically for the entertainment of the president. We see this, they posting these videos on social media. There are other agendas in the administration as well, and it is understood that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is really currently driving U.S. policy towards Venezuela. And the broader deployment in the Caribbean, to include the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group, which is steaming towards the Caribbean. This is far beyond what you would need to take out alleged drug smuggling vessels in the region. So what is that about? Well, it's about regime change. It's about the Secretary of State's regime change project of trying to oust Nicolás Maduro from Caracas, either by intimidating him, coercing him to step down, emboldening those around him to topple him, but potentially even taking direct military action against Venezuela itself. We saw a lengthy report in the New York Times yesterday about the various military options that the U.S. government is developing to potentially take strikes against drug trafficking organizations in Venezuela, including the ELN, as Laura just described, it has a presence there, but also against the so-called Cartel de Soles, okay, which is comprised of, allegedly, according to the U.S. government, comprised of senior Venezuelan military officers, and according to the U.S. government, is headed by Nicolás Maduro. Now, the U.S. government has labeled this organization as a terrorist organization, okay, and refers not just to the people aboard these vessels as, quote, narco-terrorists, but refers to Nicolás Maduro himself as a narco-terrorist. So you can see how the administration is teeing up the use of military force against Venezuela, cloaking it in the guise of counterterrorism, cloaking it in the guise of counter-narcotics, and it may be be for the benefit of the president himself that the Secretary of State may have sold the president on these narratives to get him on board with this regime change project in Caracas. The president has not made a decision reportedly as to whether he's going to actually take these strikes on land in Venezuela, but he keeps talking about strikes on land, not just strikes at sea, and Venezuela seems the most obvious target for any such military action.
I saw two hands over here, so I'm going to go to Sanho first, and then Lada, I really want to hear from you, especially what are people feeling? Because I think that is so important. Again, centering that there are real people's lives at the center of this. So Sanho, over to you first.
So Brian talked about terrorism and what excites Donald Trump in terms of going after these performative explosions and things. I'll go a little bit further. I think what attracts Trump to this policy, it's almost irresistible to him. It's in many ways the ultimate power, the power of the wrathful, angry God of the Old Testament, who can look down from the heavens and smite anyone who displeases him without any legal consequences to himself. And I think that in many ways, that's the ultimate power. He's like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. It's his precious. He wants that. And the danger is that he will move, if he gets away with it internationally, he'll try to move it domestically. Pam Bondi said as much at the Antifa summit at the White House a few weeks ago. She said, we intend to do to Antifa, which is not an organization, no membership roles, it's whoever they call Antifa. We plan to do to Antifa what we did to these cartels, to take them apart. Whether that means drone strikes, I don't know, but it's very scary. So we know, however, that police in this country have often shot people in the back, right? But they would never go into a court of law and say, Your Honor, I chased this guy 5 blocks. I was getting kind of tired. It was hot outside. So I just took out my service pistol and shot him in the back and killed him. Why would he be running away if he wasn't guilty, right? They would never argue that in a court of law because they would lose and they would be punished. But now the President of the United States is saying this from the Oval Office. We don't need evidence. We're not going to show you any evidence. We're just going to kill people outright. So this is now doctrine. It's not something that they cover up in Black Lives Matter protests about it. This is being broadcast from the White House, and that is, I think, the real danger here is that he's taking this unchecked power, and every time he unlocks a new power, whether it be tariffs, whether it be rescissions, whether it be other things, he uses it like a child who picks up a machine gun and starts just spraying the room gleefully with laughter about how he uses these new powers that he's found. And this one is a pretty dangerous one. It's the power of extrajudicial killing. And he has said many, many times over the years how much he admires former President Rodrigo Duterte, who is now sitting in The Hague facing charges of crimes against humanity for what he did in the Philippines, which is basically to kill up to about 30,000 extrajudicial killings by many estimates.
Also under the guise of
the drug war.
Thank you, Sanho. Laura, help us understand how this is actually being felt by people who have long advocated for a change in Venezuela.
Yes, that's why I started explaining the context in Venezuela and what happened last year to also understand the despair of Venezuelans that have committed to many different routes, democratic and peaceful routes to achieve a transition, and that has not been possible so far. And the complex humanitarian emergency that the country is undergoing. People are very worried about inflation. It is more and more hard every time to be able to feed your family inside Venezuela. So people are more concerned about what they're going to put on their food on their table, the next day, more than of a U.S. armed attack. That is the feeling that we are tracking with some of our partners on the ground. But I will go back to something that is really relevant, also going back to what Katherine was saying, and is that it seems obvious, but we need to say it over and over again. Truth matters and law matters. So the Venezuelan government has done so many horrific things that is being investigated before the ICC for the commission of crimes against humanity. There are many reports from the UN fact-finding mission that document these human rights violations. And this information that I shared with you also on the links with illicit economies, even though they're not what the US administration has said to be. So with all this evidence, why is it necessary to lie? It's actually making things more complicated for Venezuelans to misconstrue what it's actually true. So that's one thing. And the other thing on the law is because what the US administration is doing here, it's doing it because the political cost of going after Maduro is so low, precisely because he's unpopular and he is a human rights violator. So because of that, it's very easy for the US administration to start with Venezuela, but the Venezuelan cause, and this pains me as a Venezuelan, is that the Venezuelan cause for democracy and human rights is being used to undermine the rule of law here. So the Alien Enemies Act, the use of the shadow docket to eliminate the TPS for Venezuelans, passing over Congress and not documenting or allowing Congress to have oversight on the use of force. These are elements that are actually hurting the US rule of law, and that can have an impact in other countries. So I think it's relevant for audiences in DC to gain a broader perspective on how Venezuelans are feeling, and also for people in Venezuela to understand how Americans are seeing this because of the impact that it can have in other countries. I was going to say something. I think in terms of also the Cartel de los Soles and Tren de Aragua, I just wanted to mention very briefly that the Hugo Carvajal and Cliver Alcalá, all of these members of the military in Venezuela and the Venezuelan government were designated under the Kingpin Act in 2008. That was under Obama. And there are a lot of investigations here in the US. There are over $4 billion in forfeited orders on money that comes also from corruption and from money laundering. So why not use this evidence and investigations that have been made by independent courts and determinations under a due process of law to actually undermine one of the pillars of support of Maduro, which is corruption. That is a lawful way to help Venezuelans in their fight for democracy rather than committing violations of international and human rights law.
Thank you so much, Laura. No, wait, because I forgot to pause for a little while for Jose. I'm so sorry. Give him a moment to catch up. While he's catching up, I'll let you all know we've got about 5 minutes before we turn to questions. So I'm going to ask you each to break down all of these complex thoughts and just let the audience know what is the one thing you want them to walk away with based on your area of expertise. All right, Brian, I'll go to you first.
The President of the United States is asserting a license to kill a prerogative to use lethal force outside the law. He's wielding that power at sea, in the Pacific and Caribbean right now, but it can be wielded elsewhere, including inside the United States. And the American public and the US Congress need to push back against that asserted prerogative.
This policy threatens people abroad, but it also threatens people at home in the United States. It not only degrades rule of law in the United States, degrades the separation of powers for something that should be congressionally authorized. Any use of force, not specifically this use of force, which would violate international law as well as the domestic law. But it degrades our democracy, it degrades due process, and it may actually be the point to do those things to the extent that the administration is trying to unlock exceptional wartime authorities that it wants to use domestically to target dissent, to target immigrants, particularly immigrants from Latin America. And so those following along with this policy need to understand that what happens abroad can come home, and maybe part of the point is to have it come home.
Got it. This is very challenging. I think I would want the audience to leave with the idea and the understanding that both things can be true. On the one side, the fact that this killings in the Caribbean are unlawful and that the US should be abiding by international law. And on the other hand, that Venezuelans are under an authoritarian rule and there's a context of repression and closure of civic space, that if these actions by the US don't lead to a transition in power, our partners on the ground, and I personally fear that it can actually embolden Maduro to crack down even more on Venezuelan civil society.
So I think it's important to understand that these policies have very little to do with actual drug policy or having any kind of impact on the drug crisis in the United States. But it has there's a confluence of interests involved. Part of it is that it's unchecked power for Donald Trump. Part of it is also he gets these stupid ideas stuck in his head over the years, and it's hard to dispel them. One of them is his obsession with oil, with Venezuelan oil. So going back to 2017, Andrew McCabe, former deputy director of FBI, mentioned in his memoir that he was in meetings with Trump where he kept talking about Venezuela and oil. Why haven't we just taken their oil? And he keeps coming back to this. He talked about it in Syria, in Iraq. We should just take their oil. He has this very simplistic notion about oil and just grabbing it and taking it. It's not that easy. So it makes no sense from a logical perspective to attack Venezuela for oil, but it might be his motivation. And I think the warning from that ought to be that he may try to take the oil, but he'll end up with ashes very possibly. And that is because oil infrastructure is incredibly fragile, vulnerable, and easy to attack. Having spent a number of years following stuff in Colombia, Adam Isaacson knows much more about this than I do, witnessing oil attacks in Colombia, a major oil producer. The guerrillas would blow up the pipelines night after night, right? The pipelines parallel the roads, they shoot some holes in it, throw a flare onto it, boom, you got a conflagration. Now, if you combine that with the technology of drones that have evolved so rapidly in the past 3 years in Ukraine, you can make long-range strikes now. So Ukraine is crippling Russian oil production with their long-range drone attacks. But even the shorter range, 10, 20, 30-kilometer range, they have fiber optic drones now that can't be jammed using electronic warfare. So you can stand off from a very safe distance and launch very effective kamikaze-type attacks with these drones, very cheap drones. So now the ability to go after refineries and oil storage tanks increases. And so yeah, it takes very few people to stay behind to form a resistance to basically blow up the one thing that would be of value to this administration. Something to keep in mind.
So what I hear is that there's such a deep complexity that to what would happen next if the US escalated, and that deep complexity is not being debated in the process that is laid out by the Constitution. It's being debated in the mind of one person, or maybe in the halls of the White House with a few people. With that, I will open it up to questions. I will be receiving them on my phone, so I'm not bored with you. I'm just checking to make sure. Okay, we've got a question about the Windward Islands. So how do you assess the attitude and position of the Windward Islands, both in terms of drug trafficking and attacks on boats that are allegedly carrying drugs from those islands to Europe? Thanks. So I guess it would be helpful. How do we understand not just Venezuela in this context, but maybe the Caribbean, the islands in the Caribbean Sea, but also other countries within now we're in the Eastern Pacific as well, but both the border on the Caribbean or the Pacific. How do we understand these other countries and how this policy is or isn't affecting and those either the responses of them or the drug trafficking?
So I think we're seeing which countries are afraid of Trump and are willing to echo his talking points, and which ones are willing to stand up and raise some objections. Dominican Republic a few weeks ago issued a press release saying, "Oh, we finally did our first collaboration with the United States against narco-terrorism." The Dominican Republic has been helping the U.S. with counter-narcotics for decades, right? They do lots of stops and seizures and stuff like that. All they've done is use this term narco-terrorism to suck up to Trump. And you have other governments saying similar things. I think, was it Barbados that objected, that raised some concerns about these things? So we're beginning to see, yeah?
I mean, there was a statement by CARICOM, and I believe the only country that has supported the U.S. administration is Trinidad and Tobago from the Caribbean.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the floor.
Yeah, so a quick comment, then a question. The quick comment is that what's fallen out of this conversation is Trump's stated desire to retake the Panama Canal, and I think it is not disconnected. He will create a war in the Caribbean and Venezuela and Colombia, and then use that as an excuse to declare that it's a national urgency to retake the canal. I think that's part of the plan. The question has to do with the reporting. I live in Bogota, and El Tiempo and other outlets there are reporting that this is actually working in the sense that the drug dealers are now looking to Africa, and they're changing their routes, and they're going to go through Africa to Europe as a way to get around some of this. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean they won't continue to enter the US market, but another unconsidered consequence of what's happening is the connections that now might be made between criminal groups in Latin America and groups in Africa that could set up dynamics that actually do bring together terrorism and narco trafficking, not because they share goals, but because they may begin to share operational collaborations. So Sanho, I thought maybe you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, so the African connection, the West African connection has been going on for a while now. They've been transiting through there to get to Europe, but also local markets as well. And it's true that, yeah, terrorists sometimes turn to the narcotics trade to raise money, and sometimes narco traffickers behave in ways that inflict terror. But again, there's no such thing as narco terrorism. I think these routes are very dynamic, and they're always shifting, both in terms of their routes and their modalities. So we've seen this evolve at a lightning pace, and this is one of the problems with the war on drugs, that we've caused this market to evolve in a Darwinian fashion, at a lightning pace. And so that after 55 years of this policy, the people we've taken out or captured tend to be the people who are dumb enough or careless enough or poor enough, vulnerable enough to get caught. Conversely, the people we miss decade after decade are the people who are the most innovative, the most cunning, the most adaptable, the most intelligent, not necessarily the most violent. Violence is not a good recipe for longevity in this field, but the ones who stay quiet and go on quiet business of making lots of money, those people prosper. And so we've had this policy of artificial selection, if you will, for super traffickers, right? So we caused this thing, we're causing this problem to evolve much faster than it normally would. So that we've seen it go from small boats to go-fast boats, to semi-submersibles that carry 6 to 12 tons at a time, to fully submersible submarines now they're building. There's also narco torpedoes that can be towed behind a yacht or a fishing boat and released if they're interdicted at sea, or bolted onto the bottoms of freighters, so that unless you're willing to search all these underneath, send divers down to look around, you're not going to find these things. And ports, of course, are designed to move products very quickly, particularly perishable ones. So you see the banana economy, for instance, being a really good conduit for drugs, because any supermarket in the world, you're going to buy a banana and it's going to come from somewhere tropical, and it's got to pass through customs pretty quickly. So yeah, this idea that you could stop this by, cutting off interdiction routes. I've crossed the Atlantic 3 times by boat, and it's a big ocean. No, it's not possible.
I guess one thing that I'll add on top of this, and in response to the last question as well, is irrespective of the route of the narcotics trafficking, irrespective of who does it, whether it is, what we would traditionally consider a terrorist organization with an ideological motive, whether it is a profit-seeking gang, the act of narcotics trafficking in and of itself is not an armed attack that is going to trigger the United States' right of self-defense or any country's right of self-defense militarily. And so whether it's going through a particular island chain, whether it's going through Africa, whichever group, that does not create the license to kill using the military. It continues to be at the level of law enforcement, and there's really no credible international law expert who would say that narcotics trafficking rises to a use of force as opposed to a market dynamic, a use of force with some sort of weapon that is going to threaten a state and its territorial integrity and its political independence and whatnot.
If I can add something very briefly to that, and it's there's under international law, the use of force is forbidden. And if there were to be permitted, it would be first because of a legitimate claim of self-defense, or because it has been authorized by the UN Security Council under the UN Charter. Even if there were a legitimate claim of self-defense, which there isn't right now, in that case, the use of force should still be necessary and proportional. And in this case, just blowing vessels, when in these videos we don't see that there is an imminent threat to the US military, then that's not justified under international law.
Just really quickly on the idea of being attacked. The idea that the US is being attacked is ridiculous in the sense that we have consumers in this country who are willing to risk serious jail time and to hand over hugely inflated amounts of money for the privilege of being attacked by these substances, right? We're asking this. This is the demand-driven problem. We're not being attacked externally. It's like saying that during alcohol prohibition, American drinkers were being attacked by bootleggers. They weren't being attacked. They were willing to fork over a lot of money for that alcohol. Not an attack.
Got a few more. Oh, I've got questions. And okay, I'm going to go to the questions on the screen, and then I'll go to a few in the room, and I'll be conscious of time. So I have 3 questions that I'll combine, and then we'll go to the room. The first is, could you delve a bit more into how this is impacting Colombia, specifically in places like Santa Marta and La Guajira? Petro has obviously been very vocally against these attacks, but what does Colombian cooperation with the US against drug trafficking look like after these military strikes? And a related question is, now that there is this disruption of diplomacy between Bogota and Washington, do you see Ecuador aligning with the US agenda to combat drugs and transnational crime? I know there's somebody from the floor that would want to answer that. And we're seeing close ties with Argentina and the DR. So is the new war on drugs going to be conducted from a different terrain other than Colombia? So question about Colombia and also about Ecuador. And I'll come back. There's another regional question, but I'll put those to you both now, or to you all now.
I will just say that, one of the functions served by these lethal strikes is demonstrative to indicate to other countries in the region that the U.S. government will take unilateral military action potentially on their territory. And the first strike on the 2nd of September came shortly before Secretary of State Marco Rubio went to Mexico for discussions with the Mexican government on enhanced security cooperation. And during that trip to Latin America, he emphasized, yes, we're prepared to act if we want to cooperate with you, but we're prepared to act unilaterally if you don't cooperate with us on enhanced security cooperation, enhanced counter-narcotics. So yes, it was a display function here.
I want to say something on the political aspect on the relationship with Colombia, because I think that the actions by the US are creating an unintended effect, which is having Petro become even closer to Maduro. So after the July 28th elections, President Petro had called on the release of the tally sheets and for Venezuela to be transparent about the elections. And that didn't happen. There was a kind of a break between, I mean, not a break, but they became straight, if you want to say it like that. And then with these attacks, they have become closer. Even a couple of weeks ago or last week, we saw the release of some of the political prisoners. There were 38 Colombian nationals detained in Venezuela, and that release took place of foreign nationals. And I think that has to do with the fact that Petro is now, let's say, defending Maduro under this. So I go back to my main argument of Maduro portraying himself as the victim, even though he's hanging on to power with no legitimacy.
There's so many questions from the floor. I'm going to take 3 at once and then take another 3, and then we'll have to wrap up. So I'll start with you.
Hi, thank you all. This was super helpful. I'm curious, should Maduro fall and should regime change take place, what does the illicit landscape in Venezuela look like after that? How is, you were talking about Cartel de los Soles and their involvement in the military. What would a potential successor have to do to sort of root that out? And what other groups are poised to sort of gain power in that circumstance?
Yes.
Yes, I'm gonna follow up with Laura's remarks. 2 quick questions. Maybe I misunderstood, but were you suggesting that Venezuelans are not currently concerned about the possibility of an armed conflict in their country? And second, when you said that U.S. should have a strong foreign policy toward Venezuela, could you clarify what would entail? Do you mean lifting the severe sanctions that are causing widespread harm and supporting a negotiated peaceful transition toward democracy? Or are you envisioning something different from WOLA's perspective, human rights orientation?
Can add something to answer, and also something someone asked on the screen. It's like, I wanted to know if, like, especially WOLA is tracking like human rights situations in the Caribbean, especially for Venezuelan migrants. There's a sizable amount of people in the Caribbean, and just to that, and obviously like the terms human trafficking for Venezuelans to Trinidad specifically. And to that, just wanted to make a comment. We have also like a comprehensive, I work at the Pan American Development Foundation. We have a program on migration and Venezuelan migrants in all the countries that are near. One thing that people have been reported just to track is that mostly no, people are not totally worried about an invasion. I feel like it's like, as Lara said, it's just so many issues that are happening in your day-to-day life that you're really not thinking about, except for young men that are apparently being detained in borders to be recruited. Beyond that.
Great. So we've got a couple of questions here. What does the illicit landscape look like after Maduro? And what would the successor need to do? I want to not forego that is a hypothetical that suggests that there is a particular outcome that would be had and it would be less complex than I think it would be than probably reality, but it's a great question to kind of think through. And then armed conflict, what is a strong foreign policy on Venezuela? And perhaps for the whole panel, a strong foreign policy on organized crime and illicit landscape. So I'll open that up for everybody, but I'll start with you, Lada, because the questions came to you.
Okay. I'll start with the first question in terms of what would happen in the case of a transition. And I would just start by saying that there's no transition from an authoritarian government to a democracy that is easy. And especially in a context like Venezuela, with what I mentioned, you have 26 years of Chavismo in power, of the dismantling of democratic institutions. You will have to, as my professor used to say on transitional justice, Doug Castle, you have to build the car and drive it at the same time. And that would be really difficult. There are some areas in the country in which it is unclear how the control of the terrain would actually take place, right? With, for example, the ELN and the southern border, the presence on the Arco Minero, the mining arch, that those things are very difficult. But I would say also that in the case of Venezuela, it's very important to understand because sometimes I hear that there are comparisons made with other contexts that don't necessarily apply to the Venezuelan case. These armed groups and illicit economies that operate in Venezuela are mainly driven by profit. They don't necessarily have an ideological perspective. So I don't foresee these people trying to, necessarily overthrow the government, but trying to rearrange their routes so they can maintain their profits. In terms of the concerns on Venezuela, Venezuela is like any other country, it has a diverse civil society, and there are different perspectives and views on this. But the majority of Venezuelans are very much concerned about their economic conditions. That's why people continue to migrate, and we have warned this over and over again. Even though we've seen with the Trump administration's policies on migration, we have seen a return to Venezuela, but that return is a wait-and-see mode return, and people are going back to very dire conditions that, as you hinted in your questions, they have been, or that complex humanitarian emergency that predates U.S. sanction has been deepened by sectoral sanctions. That is also true. So I think that I'm not saying that people are not worried at all, but people don't think necessarily that this will happen. Let's remember that the deployment of the military started in August, and we're in October, and people continue to wait. Well, is something really going to happen? I mean, there's a lot of expectation, and that despair brings people to hope that there will be a transition. And on what should U.S. policy look like? The first thing that I would say is that U.S. policy should be based on evidence and facts. The second thing is that it should be robust and have a long-term view. And when I say this, I mean because we've seen a fragmented foreign policy towards Venezuela this year. And human rights and democracy should be at the center, not just the U.S. economic interest or curbing migration, because we understand that the root causes of all this crisis that has led 27% of the population to flee the country has to do also with the dismantling of democracy in Venezuela. So that's why I mentioned what happened with Rick Grenell. We, of course, think that there should be a negotiation, there should be a peaceful resolution of things, but not all forms of dialogue lead to democratic openings. And that's what happened with the return of the people from El Salvador, that their right to due process was violated, of course, but Maduro announced that 80 people were going to be released. Our partners on the ground were able to verify 72 of those cases, which included people like common prisoners. No criteria of, for example, political prisoners for age or gender or health conditions were followed. And in the next day, over 20 people were detained again. So we have 1,074 people detained in Venezuela, and today 176 people missing. We don't know their whereabouts. So with this context, it's important to keep in mind that, yes, there should be a negotiation, but not just a negotiation that puts at the heart of U.S. policy just their interests, but the regional interests and the interests of democracy and human rights.
I'm conscious of time, and so I actually think that I'm sorry to everybody who had a question. We're here all day. No, I think that there'll be an opportunity to come speak a little bit more with the panelists. I want to thank everyone for this conversation. It's an important, complex context that requires dialogue, and there's so many different considerations and policy expertise that is required to understand what a pathway forward is or could be, and just a re-emphasis that those dialogues and conversations and debates are not happening. And that is why we need to ensure that there is space for those conversations to take place. I will ask each of our speakers to give us a 30-second kind of closing reflection, and I will then close with some additional thank yous.
Just to follow on your remarks there, the U.S. Constitution envisions that it is the Congress that will authorize use of military force after public debate and consideration. That decision will not be left to the whims of one man. And so it's up for Congress to reassert its constitutional prerogatives in the space, not just with respect to the unlawful killings at sea, but also with respect to a possible illegal war in Venezuela.
This policy is a threat to rule of law internationally, a threat to rule of law domestically. And the idea that we're going to create a democracy abroad by degrading American democracy is not a credible one.
I would say that a policy that, I would say that Venezuelans are trapped between an authoritarian government and an eroding democracy here, and a policy that does not have at the center the people that are suffering the most.
I think it's important to point out that these are policies that are not crafted by some well thought out interagency process where the stakeholders come together and say, we've gamed through all the scenarios and all the risks, and this is our measured recommendation to you, Mr. President. No, this is about the whims and tantrums of a mad king and being surrounded by sycophants who are too afraid to correct him or to present any negative information. And that is the worst possible way to make policy.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Just a reminder that this is also a robust and diverse kind of civil society space in the United States, trying to address at the heart of it our joint concerns that these are killings outside the law that further degrade rule of law. And so appreciate that there are different perspectives of how we get to the same answer. And that answer is that these killings need to stop, and that there needs to be accountability. And so I also want to put into context what this says about this administration. This administration is working very hard to dismantle the basic ideas of human rights, both that they are universal. That means that they apply to everyone. Everyone has the inherent right to due process, to right to life, right to expect that they won't be killed with no evidence, and that their names will be lost to history, right? These are just people that have just been lost. And this administration is really working hard to dismantle that idea of universality in many different places, and instead putting in place an idea of relativism, that depending on who you are or where you're born or who you were born as, that you have a different set of rights that are determined not by international agreement or by constitutions that guide the implementation of those international agreements and agreements within a domestic context, but by a sovereign who can decide what those rights are. And so we're seeing that in many different places. And this policy is kind of a very concrete demonstration of how we can expect human rights to be treated and international law to be treated elsewhere. And the other is an underlying belief that rule of law is not to be applied to a sovereign. And so we're seeing the many different ways that while human rights require the rule of law, international law requires a system of a multilateral system that operates with some level of comity. Instead, we're seeing a unilateral approach to interpretation of what is and isn't legal. And so for our embassy folks in the room, if we can ever be helpful in putting not just this, but the broader context of the foreign policy into scope for you. I think there's many civil society groups, not just those represented here, but represented more generally in the community that will be happy to support analysis and help you understand what we're seeing from our perspective. So thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to WOLA. Thank you to our translator, and thank you to everybody that participated, and recognizing again, there are so many diverse opinions and ideas, and this is a really helpful way to get to understanding more what we're all up against and how we can work together.